There we are. Somebody heard you.
Just in time.
Thank you very much, as always. Perfect Swiss timing. Okay. So we've been talking about Rambam's Tshuvot, and we've seen the Rambam very differently to how we would have regarded him in the past, the basis of his Mishneh Torah and his Moreh Nevuchim. Great halachist, great philosopher, but is he a great leader of the Jewish people, and does he have the empathy necessary for leading them in difficult times? And the answer is yes. The Igeret Hashmad that we read so carefully, together with his Tshuvot on the way to treat a ger, shed new light for many of us on the Rambam. The warmth and the empathy, the milk of human kindness, okay, the ability of a posek, and this is the hallmark of the Responsa literature. So it is the world of Responsa where we see the posek perhaps taking issue with the black letter law, with what's written in the Gemara, what's written in the codes, and looking at what's going on around him to the Jewish people and in the world, and managing to craft a solution that speaks to human beings rather than the letter of the law. So we've seen that in relation to Shiur, the whole issue of being lenient in relation to allowing people in. Then we saw that in the context of Ovadia Ger Tzedek, how the Rambam defends Ovadia in every respect from any attacks by fundamentalists, and also, of course, is a champion of the treatment of the Ger as a full Jew. So, and we talked a little about Yehuda Levi and the possibility that perhaps he is less generous than the Rambam, perhaps far less generous, but perhaps not as mean as some of his critics, especially modern Israeli critics, have thought. Now we're going to have a look at another aspect that I've called the femme fatale, because it is the katlanit. So let's have a look at the Gemara, Yevamot, Avsam, Samach Daled Amud Bet, Ve'od, Eimar de Pligi, Linyan Milah, B'Nisuin Mi Pligi. So the Gemara in Yevamot actually talks about the type of women one should not marry because they may be in some way defective. And one of the discussions is about Brit Milah. In other words, if you have a son who is circumcised in the Brit Milah, and he dies because of exsanguination, because the blood will not clot, and there's no way of stopping him bleeding, so he bleeds to death. Second son bleeds to death. Then there's a machloket between the Tanaim as to whether or not you're going to circumcise the third son. Remember, to be a Jew, you should be circumcised, very important, but your Jewish identity is not impugned if you're not circumcised because of a danger to your life. So you'll be a perfectly good Jew. You will just carry around your Ola forever, okay? So that is what will happen there. Now, the argument is, because they weren't that scientific in those days, didn't have enough scientific apparatus to check things out, how many boys need to die before you say the family has a problem with, say, hemophilia, the loss of blood, loss of ability to clot blood, and therefore we should not circumcise. Two views. One says you don't circumcise the third son. The other view is you don't circumcise the fourth son. B'Nisuin Mi Pligi is a similar argument in relation to marriage, not only Brit Milah, yes, Vatanya Niset Arishon Umet, Lasheni Umet. You married a woman and then you died, husband died. Then the second husband also died. Lishlishi lo tinaseh. That woman is not meant to marry a third husband. She should remain unmarried for the rest of her life. Divrei Rebbe, These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Lashlishi tenaseh, Larevi'i lo tenaseh. Can't be sure after only two. You wait until the third one dies. When he dies, the fourth one will be spared the Brit Milah. Okay. The Brit Milah. Sorry. You will not marry, okay. That's the argument in Brit Milah, and we apply the argument to the Katlanit as well. Bishlam agabe Milah, then the Gemara says, okay, I can understand why in relation to Brit Milah, we count, and if there are too many fatalities, 2 according to Rebbe and 3 according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, we will not do another Brit Milah on the son. Because Ika Mishpacha Dorafe Dama. There is a family that their blood is defective and they insist their hematology is defective, and therefore they say have hemophilia, and nothing we can do about that, so we have to stop the Brit Milah. Vika Mishpacha Dekami Dama. Some families, okay, are good with blood clotting, thick blood. Ela Nisuin Maitama. But what should be the reason for saying that if a woman has had 2 husbands die on her, she's not allowed to marry the third because we assume she's dangerous? What's the danger? Okay, in the Brit Milah, I understand what the danger is. We see it. The boys die. But what's up with the woman here? Amale Rav Mordechai Ravashi. Hachi Amar Avime me Hagrunia Mishmeid Ravhuna Mayan Gorem. Ravhuna says the woman's reproductive tract is problematic. She has something fatal in her reproductive tract, and whenever the husband has intercourse, he is actually risking death. And so don't marry the third woman, according to...
Is there an age distinction also? Because eventually everybody dies.
Eventually they do.
Yes, so there should be an nafka between whether we're talking about people in their 20s or we're talking about people who are, over 50, over 60 or something.
We're not going to actually go down that path. We're actually going to go down a much more principled path and look at whether this is actually a real threat or not. So before we get to that, but certainly you're on the point, we do take into account later on in later literature why the husbands died. So the husband, say, was killed because of Kiddush Hashem, okay? They burst into his home and they said, baptize or death, and he chose death. That presumably has nothing to do with his sexual relationships with the wife. So we could discount that death, and we could count from deaths that are to do with a disease that we don't say have a clear etiology. But we haven't got there yet, okay? Moment, we're just looking what it says in the Gemara. Ravashi Amar Mazal Gorem. Ravashi says it's her destiny. Now, when he says Mazal, he means destiny, your celestial destiny. What the stars and the planets say about you. This is astrology, okay?
But there's a machloket about whether Ein Mazel, about Ein Mazel Israel, whether the idea of Mazel even applies or not.
Well, we know that on an individual level, Devora, it does apply, according to most rabbis right through the ages. The major exception, as we'll read in the next Shiur, is Maimonides, who denied astrology completely, okay?
Yeah.
But Mazal for Yisrael as a collective. In other words, we are exempt from the ironclad laws of history that may be determined, if you believe in astrology, by the celestial bodies. But at an individual level, most rabbis have said, take care not to put yourself into a compromising situation. Don't get don't have your blood let when the planet Mars is in the ascent, because then you might never recover from the bloodletting, okay?
Oh my gosh.
This is taken seriously, very seriously, right through until the present day, okay? Not that you would need to do it absolutely, but you shouldn't discard it, okay? So That's something we'll talk about on next week when we look at Rambam's letter on astrology. But now we're looking at halacha in the Gemara. The Gemara, and we take it seriously, cites a story about Abaye, less well known. Jean, would you like to read?
I would like to add that if I remember, Rav Mordechai is a pupil of Rav Ashi.
He is indeed.
And strangely that he allows himself to say something different.
He reminds his teacher of a tradition. Remember, when they say a pupil, could be a pupil of many years standing and possibly quite close in age. You spent a lot of time. Would you like to tackle the next piece of Gemara?
Amrale bat Rav Chisda, man have aidna bebedina. Apparently, what is how do the Beis Din decide today?
No. What went on in Beit Din today? Rava, who married Rav Chisda's daughter, came back from the Beit Din. He was a Dayan, and he said, we had a very exciting day. Now, what was the exciting day? Amar La. And she realized that something was up. You know, he came back usually tired and bored. Today, he was really very perky and very feisty. Why? Amar La.
Choma. The Vitu de Abaye, donc apparently Choma is the daughter of Rav Chisda.
No, the Bitu means wife.
The
Bitu is always wife, and here it means the widow. Choma, who is apparently really good looking, came to court today seeking, I think, permission to remarry. Choma had two husbands, they both died. Abaye allowed himself to marry her, following Rebbe rather than Rashbag. And when she came to court after Abaye died, because he died shortly afterwards, Rava got very excited. So he comes home and his wife says, what's up with you this evening, my man? Okay, and he says, well, you know, Choma was in the Beit Din. We never had something so exciting for many, many years. So what did Mrs. Rava do? Nafka, Jean?
Abatra me.
Machtala bekulfe deshida. Nafka abatra. Now, what happened was Rav Chisda's daughter, Rava's wife, Mrs. Rava, looked for Choma. She chased her down, and then she took from her salon a strap that was holding the cabinets together. Ada afgala.
Mikule mechuza. Amrala.
She searched for the whole of. Right? Machoza Amrala. So she said to her, Katlich what does that mean? Katalt. You've killed three. To kill, hence the word katlanit, a dangerous wife, a killer wife, okay? Femme fatale in the most extreme sense.
Attack le miktal acharina. You want to kill a fourth one.
And you want to kill a fourth one. You come to Beit Din to get permission to remarry. I'm driving you out of town. Okay? This is
information. Okay.
All right. Could we have those who are talking, could they please either mute or desist? So the Gemara is fairly clear. We both have a law and we have a story. The law, it's clear. The halakha is like Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, because it's a matter of pikuach nefesh. So we say, if two husbands have died, well, we don't allow this woman to marry a third one. And there's a story to prove it, in fact. Abaye fell for Choma, and he married her, and look what happened. So he shouldn't have married her. He presumably held like Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, who says, look, let's try the third one. And then let's try the third one. Well, he died too. So you should not marry a katlanit. That's what the Gemara says. And everybody who learns the Gemara takes it very seriously. Correct, Jean?
Tshuvat harimigash.
I didn't. I asked you to say how seriously do you take the Gemara? The answer you should have said is absolument. We take the Gemara Dvorah very seriously. This is not a joke, okay? Everything in the Gemara. If you like to read the Tshuvat Harif, which is the next source, go ahead. Tshuvat Harif. Now we know who the Rif was. Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. very famous for being the basically founder or purveyor of the Talmudic tradition from North Africa. He was a Talmud of Rabbi Nissim and Rabbi Hanania in Kairouan in Tunisia. Then he set up a great yeshiva in Fez, where Yehuda Halevi was a student of his. But then, as often happened in those days, he was a dayan of the Bet Din. He upset a rather wealthy and powerful man, and he had to flee for his life. So he went to Spain. He fled to Andalusia,
Lucena.
and he set up a yeshiva in Lucena in the area of Cordoba in 1089, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva until his death. And he appointed the Rimigash, Rabbi Yosef Halevi ibn Migash, as his successor. And the Rimigash was the teacher of Maimon, the Dayan, who was the father of the Rambam. And the Rambam always regarded his teachers as Rimigash and the Rif. So the next source is the Chuvat HaRif. The Rif is famous for having written a mini Talmud. If you don't have patience to read the whole Gemara, the Rif will give you the Gemara with all the arguments taken out, mainly what is the halachic bottom line. So, Jean, I see you're in a reading mode.
Kivan de Kaimalan Benisuin Rabbi de Shlishi Shlotinase.
Which means, of course,
Donc,
that we hold like
the law that, according to Rabbi, that the third is already forbidden.
Exactly. Rabbi, afilu
im amar hashlishi hanichuli, like Abaye. Klum asura rabanan mishum sakanta.
It's only because of a sakana. So if I
like
choose
Ravashi.
to endanger myself, I can do it.
Kivan
But the Rif says kevan.
Hu en shomin lo.
Because it's okay.
שנרצה להרוג את עצמו, אין מניחים אותו אם נוכל לו.
The phrase im nuchal lo, nuchal lahem means if we want to go up, as Yeshua and Caleb said, we can overcome. But what it means here is that it isn't only a sakana. It's not a matter of your choice, whether you want to risk your life or not. It's an isur. It's in the Gemara. It says, lo yisa, and therefore we have to stop you. And because it is dangerous, we don't let people commit suicide if we can help it. Im nuchal lo. So the Rif seems to be very clear that when he, as the first of the great codifiers, who gives us a code of laws, who tells us what the halakha is, resolves a dispute between Rebbe and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, well, he says we take it seriously and we do not allow the woman, if we can, to marry a third man, the third man, and if the man insists, we will try and dissuade him very seriously from so doing. And then we look at the other great teacher or rabbi to whom Rambam pays great respect, the Rimigash, Harav Yosef Halevi ibn Migash. And what does he say? Let's see, Shmuley, do you want to have a crack at that? But you have to unmute.
Yes, I did. Given the Kaimalon Binisuin.
No. The next one. Masha Amru.
מה שאמרו נושאת לראשון, הוא מת לשני, הוא מת לשלישי, לא תינשא.
Right.
הלכה היא, ומי שירצה לעבור על זה, מונעים אותו, ואם אומר, אני רוצה לסכן בעצמי, אין שומעים לו, שאין לו בשוס לאבד עצמו. He can't commit suicide. ואין בואו לנו להניחו לעשות זה, בפרט הועיל ואוסרו חז"ל.
And Chazal, in other words, the Gemara says you mustn't do it. You mustn't do it. Okay, and the woman is to be prevented from remarrying, and men are warned not to marry her. והנה זה היה מכלל.
זה מכלל הדברים הסבורים שאין בו לשום אדם לעבור עליהם, גם אין מניחים אותם לעבור עליהם.
In other words, not only should you not do it, but we'll step in and prevent you from marrying this Isha Katlanit. Okay.
So who would marry him? Which Rav would allow him to get married? How could he marry her if nobody would marry him?
We are going to get to that too.
Okay.
And the Rambam Paskins, as one would expect, the Gemara is codified. The Rif is the first codifier. In his Chuvot, the Rimigash is equally prohibitive in terms of the Katlanit, as is the Rith. Everything follows the line of precedence. We have no problem. The Rambam himself in his code of law, and he has to be faithful and true to his code. What does he say? So Shmuley, give us the Rambam, please, in the Mishneh Torah. Isha.
אישה שנשאת לשני, לשני אנשים
לשני אנשים ומתו.
לשלישי לא תינשא, ואם נשאת
Vimnisat.
אם נישאת לא
לא
תצא.
תצא. Now this is interesting. Rambam is the first one who apparently puts an incidental light to open the door slightly. Says, well, if you already got married, we don't force you to divorce. Now, we haven't found that in the Rith. We haven't found that in the Rinigash, okay? And the Gemara has nothing to say about that, but the Rambam clearly is already putting his foot in the door. He has no option as a codifier of law but to tell us what the Gemara says. The din of the Gemara is that the Katlanit must not marry a third man. But Rambam adds, if she happened to marry, then we will not make the couple divorce.
How does this compare to like a Kohen marrying who goes off and marries a divorced woman and it's later found out that he did that?
You've opened up another very significant discussion that we're not going to go into now, but I am going to give you the chapter heading, which is, there is a difference between a sinful marriage and a marriage that needs to be taken apart and abolished, okay? So you can have what we call kiddushin tofsin. The marriage is a valid marriage, but it's a sinful one. In other words, parties, to avoid being continual sinners, should divorce. But the marriage itself is still legally valid until it's brought to an end. And it's this divergence that Israeli courts, secular courts, used in order to deal with Kohen marriages to divorcees, to say that they should not be regarded as an illegal marriage. So I'm going to say a lot to say about that. You're onto a good point, but we're going to read the Rambam, okay? So all of this seems to be very clear, that we have a halakha. It's a pretty draconian halakha. Of course, from a sociological point of view, you could say that this halakha is a bit of folklore that we find all over, not only amongst Jews, but Christians and Muslims too. And it actually goes to, if we were going to be very academic here, the demonization of women. Somehow they are dangerous. We remember those big books about witches in the Middle Ages, maleficence, okay, women being dangerous, because there's no issue in the Gemara about a katlan. We don't have any males, in relation to which the Gemara says, if a wife dies, okay, married to one man, and then his second wife dies, is he called a katlan, and is he prevented from marrying any other woman? No such thing.
But could that be because women so often died in childbirth? To lose two wives is fairly common, to lose two husbands less so.
Perhaps it is because of childbirth, but then there were times when men also died in droves, okay? War or pogrom or crusade, or travels. They traveled for business, but it could be at the same time. You could say it's very chauvinist. In other words, there is something here when you say mayan gorem or mazal gorem, okay, something to do with a woman, okay, that she might release these sinister forces that threaten the life of the innocent husband, okay? So I'm offering you that as something to think about. Would not be untypical of that age. And as I said, I could have brought you sources from Muslim and Christian literature and writing, which are similar, not quite as legally defined as the katlanit, okay? And the word clearly occurs in the Gemara. Rashi also cites the term katlanit. But anyhow, let's read the tshuva of the Rambam. And
Im niseit lo tetse. But how could she have been married, or she hid the situation, or
No,
the rabbi
listen,
did not? What means that?
Listen carefully, and now you'll get the answer, okay? Patience is wonderful. Lo Omram Zal. Rambam was asked a question. Niset rishon umet lasheni umet lo tinaseh lashishi mishum safek nefashot. The questioner said, you know, we've learned and we've heard that the third husband definitely not on the cards, and the woman should be prevented from marrying him. He should be prevented from marrying her because it's putting your life in danger. וכבר מצינו שהוא דוחה מילה שנכרתו עליה י' ג' בריתות, and we know that danger to life overrides the mitzvah Brit Milah. And Brit Milah, there's a Gemara in Nedarim, I think, that says that there are 13 Britot. In other words, if you look at Breshit, Perek Yud Zayin, the Perek of the Brit Milah, you'll find that Brit is mentioned in a whole chapter, not in relation to the Milah, but 13 times. And Rashi and Tosfot connected to the Yud Gimel Midot. Milah is very important, but still, in order to save life, we will not do it. לפי מה שאמרו ז"ל באישה, שמעלה בן הראשון ומת, שני ומת שלישי, לא תימול, אף על פי שהמילה בכרת. התשובה, this is the Rambam's תשובה. Now everybody listen very carefully. תמה אני תמיהה גדולה, I'm really amazed, על תלמידי חכמים יקרים, dear, wise scholars of Torah, עסוקים בתורה תמיד, שהסתפקו עליהם מדרגות האיסורים, that they should be confused about the different levels of prohibitions, עד זאת המידה, to the extent, לא יבדילו בין האסור מן התורה, they can't distinguish between what the Torah forbids, למשהו אסור מדבריהם, that which only the rabbis prohibit, ולמשהו מגונה בלבד ואין איסור בו, and things that we shouldn't do, but there's no prohibition involved in them at all. ויותר תימה בשאלה הוא השוואתכם ספק נפשות הבא בידיים שדוחה מילה. And I'm really amazed. How can anybody could possibly think of making a comparison between milah, when the boys bleed to death, the safek nefashot, which is clearly threat to human life, שחוששים לו על דרך הניחוש והכישוף והדמיונות והדימויים. And the katlanit, the whole thing is based upon divining, witchcraft, pure, silly imagination, and false and irrational thinking. Now the Rambam says something really interesting, because he was a psychologist. He says, look, people think that these things really are serious, okay? All of the astrology, all of voodoo, for example. I put a pin in a doll, and somebody 25 miles away on the same Caribbean island has a terrible heart attack and dies. Why would that happen? Why could you have anecdotal evidence of that? Because we have gufot halushei habinyan. So we have people who have weak psyches, or their psychology is weak, and if you suggest something to them, it'll happen. It's like a psychosomatic thing. I know that my greatest enemy has put a needle into a doll, okay, 25 miles away. I suddenly feel bad, and then I could even have a terrible disease or a heart attack and die, okay? So Rambam says it's all rubbish, but it could happen. And I think this is very insightful indeed, and we should give Rambam credit for his psychology here. Ach lo bi'ur elu anyanim hu kavanat hatshuva. But I'm not going to go into that now, and we will go into this in great detail next week. El al da'atenu shezot hamuzeket muguna shenintesei l'shar anashim aval en isur bazeh klal. Look, it might be a little off color to marry a woman whose husband seemed to be dying in small droves, but it's not a halakhic prohibition. ואין הבדל בין אדם שאישה מוחזקת או יאכל מקישה דאסור גנאה. There are things that people shouldn't be eating. It's not nice, okay? It's really disgusting. But, they haven't committed a sin. Halakha l'maaseh etzleinu, and now he said something quite remarkable. It is our halakha, practical halakha, says the Rambam, b'chol aratzot Andalus tamid, in all of Andalusia. And the Rambam always goes back to Andalusia. He had to leave when he was 13 because of the Almohadi persecutions. But this is his ideal of a Jewish society, rational, philosophical, halachically sophisticated, and she'im yamut lisha ba'al achar ba'al, husbands are dying in droves, mispar ba'alin, hi lo timna min linaseh. There's no problem in her marrying another man. B'yichud keshehi bishnot ha'bachru. As you said, Devorah, okay, especially when the women are young. We're not going to stop her marrying. And as Yael Berman said, perhaps, the reason why the men died, we don't know. But we're not going to put it down to Katlanit, neither Mazal nor Mayan. It's neither the reproductive tract nor her fate written in the stars. Biglal have said sheyesh lakshosh bazeh, because it's a terrible thing to do, and we lose out much more than we gain. I am just going to read from an earlier tshuva of the Rambam, Chelik Aleph Siman Tet Vav, where he was asked about a bet din that prevented a young woman marrying, and they said, Amra la'at katlanit, you are a deadly woman. Sharei niftaru imach shnei baalim, two of your husbands have died. V'nishara isha b'mitzuka. And the result of the Rambam is that the woman is now in terrible straits. Be'ela hayamim hakashim shel ra'av. It's a time of famine. The harvest failed, as they often did in the Middle Ages. Lo yachla litol davar min hakarka she'iniach ba'ala. So the land that she was left by her husband from the ketubah is of no use to her. And in order for a woman to have any means in the 13th century, the 12th century, 13th, she had to have a man. We know that because in England, it's only in the 19th century that we had married women's property acts. There was no ownership of property independently for a woman. And so she is starving for a piece of bread. But in addition to that humane consideration, וכבר מצינו שחכמי התלמוד התירו לעבור על איסורי הנאה ושחררו עמתה עד שלא נשאר מכשול לפריצים. Gemara in Gittin tells us about releasing a female slave who's young, because being a slave, a Hebrew slave, she's not allowed really to marry anyone, not a non-Jewish slave and not a Jewish man. And so you have to release her immediately, okay? Because she wasn't married either by her master or his son, because you're putting her in a sexual bind. And since she cannot live as a, what do we say? An honest woman, she has to live as a dishonest woman. And that also is a state of affairs we want to avoid. So are we encouraging our women to live promiscuously? The Mahadrim, actually, funnily enough, are not the Haredim. They are the Andalusians of the philosophical mode that Rambam loves so much. They're the ones, and this is the answer to your question, Jean. Look, Shelo lekadesh muchzeket. The Bet Din, the Rabbanut, will not do the Kiddushin for a Katlanit. Ela lomarla. What? Listen, they say to her, befeirush, explicitly, Im timtzi mish sheikadesh otach, harei anu lo nechayvo legareshcha. If you find a husband, go ahead, okay? We will not make him divorce you. Ela davar talui bach v'hayu ha'isha im chatana ma'arimim. So the woman finds a husband, and they are ma'arimim. Jean, what does ma'arimim mean?
Eh bien, orma, donc te faire
Orma.
une ruse,
They
say in English.
A ruse, excellent. It's a ruse. They will get together. They will deceive. Okay, they will a legal fiction. They will act in a dishonest manner.
Donc this was possible at their time. Today, when
That's what the Rambam says. Now, was it true is another question. Or is he just conjuring up something? Sheikatshum shnayim alma. All you need for a wedding is what?
שתי עדים,
witnesses.
ובזמנם
Two
זה היה
עדים.
יכול להיות.
Exactly. You need a willing, you don't need a star if you've got kesef. You've got a willing bride, a willing groom, two witnesses, haret mukudeshet li, with tabat, with a star, or with a biyah. Okay? And that's it. You don't need a rabbi. You certainly don't need a bet din. Ari anu, okay, so
ואחר כך היא באה לבית דין.
and then she goes to the bet din, v'kotvin laktubah. They, of course, know how to write a ketubah, which the couple must have, that they write the ketubah, v'nichnesa luchupa, and then umavarchin ota bet din sheva brachot la, the bet din of the Rav, ho'il v'nitkatsha. The kiddushin are a fait accompli. So this is the Rambam saying, this is what we used to do in Andalusia. In this case, because we never believed in katlanit, it's irrational. We said, but there is a halachic prohibition. We get around the halachic prohibition using orma, and this is called a harama, a legal fiction, okay, for a good purpose. We want a young woman to be able to marry. We don't know why their husbands died. People die from all sorts of reasons and causes. But the Rambam, for one, does not believe in astrology, is a great opponent, as we'll see next week, and B, knows medically, because he was, after all, the private physician of the Wazir of Egypt. There's nothing in the woman's reproductive cavity that cuts down her husband one by one, unless she puts something there. Okay? So, I'm not going to repeat what Debbie said. If you were really interested, you can ask her in person, okay? So this is the ruse, exactly as Jean said. Now, line 6, he says something quite remarkable. Who is Rabbi Yitzchak Zal Bal Arachot?
The Rif.
The Rif. וכך בית דינו של רבנו יוסף הלוי תלמידו ז"ל.
מיגש.
עשה כל מי שנמשך אחריהם. וכך הורינו אנחנו ועשינו בארץ מצרים. Now the Rambam arrived in Egypt in, we said, 1165, 1166. He becomes the preeminent halakhic authority, and all the Egyptian rabbis are required to go along with this policy. מאז באנו אליהם. וכל זה שלא במקום מצווה. Now this is when there's no mitzvah to marry this third woman. We're talking about regular marriage, okay? A regular katlanit. Kolshken b'yivama. What happens if the woman is a yivama? And remember, the Sephardim did yibum. Ashkenazim stopped doing yibum. It's a machloket in the Gemara. Shenafla liyibum. הם טוענים בזה, זאת הטענה, ולא תידחה מצווה של תורה מפני שחששה בעלמא? Are we going to say, don't do the mitzvah of yibum with a third wife because of this baseless suspicion that there may be something fatal about the femme? Okay? זה דבר שלא שמענו מעולם, כמותו ולא חשבתי שיראה כלל הדעת השלם בשכלו. And how could any rabbi worth his salt have even entertained the idea that we should not? And apparently that was the question. The questioner asked about a decision by a bet din not to allow a yivama to be married to the avam, but to do chalitza because she had had two husbands dying on her. Rambam says this is halachic nonsense. Okay?
But that means that according to Rambam, we do not even need the orma here.
We use the orma because of rea of halachic and rabbinic real politik. Now, the orma is there because the Rambam knows that what he's saying is very original and will be very controversial. Imagine, Jean, if you got up in the middle of a shiur given in Agudat Achim Shul and said, actually, the Katlonis is a lot of narishkeit. what response do you think you get?
Apocalypse?
Apoplectic. Exactly. You'd be thrown out, right? They take you and they throw you out. So the Rambam knows how to, we're going to see he does that in relation to the repetition of the Amida. We'll have a look at that. But this is a tactic that we use much of the time. You know, Yehuda, by the way, was very good at this, and we're going to see how he does it, hopefully, if we have time to get to his take on the Katlanit, because great halachic authorities are always aware that they need to cover their flank. Okay, so let's see. But in the case of a Yivama, Jean, you're right. Rambam would say, come to Bet Din, we'll do the marriage front up. Because there's no question that halachically speaking, the mitzvah of Yibum, which is the mitzvah midoraita, is definitely far superior to this chashash ba'alma, this baseless idea, which is probably more folk law than it is halakha, even though it appears in the Babylonian Talmud. And as we see, it's in the Shulchan Aruch as well, okay? And azot hayavama la din kol yavama, we treat the yavama as every other yavama, v'tityabem or timrod. She can either marry the yavam or she can say no, v'teitzei belo ktuba, then she loses her ktuba, and the yavam has to do chalitza. V'yidua lachem askala psak halacha, v'mitzvat yibum kodemet mitzvat chalitza. Then he goes in, I've just mentioned this briefly, to the sugya in the Talmud, Samachloket Chachamim and Abba Shaul. Whether we do today Yibum or whether we do Chalitza. And the reason is that there is a view, Abba Shaul says that because your sister-in-law is basically an erva, under the laws of the Torah, you cannot marry your sister-in-law, your brother's wife, okay? And then we get into Henry VIII and Prince Arthur and all that story, which we've been through before. I'm not going to tell you the whole thing again, but it's a sin. The exception is when the brother dies without any children, then you are allowed to marry your sister-in-law, okay? Abba Shaul says you can only do this if you're really sincere and you're not doing it because she's beautiful or good-looking or rich. And because people's motives are not pure, we don't want them to get close to erva, and therefore we say we no longer do yibum, we do charitza. Chachamim say no, this is a law, and we approach it like any other law. Sephardim generally did Yibum. Ashkenazim very early on went in for Charitza. So at the end, we say that the Rambam, not only does he disregard the din of the Gemara entirely, he also prays in support the Rif and the Rimigash. But we read the Rimigash, correct? What did the Rimigash actually say? He said, we keep the din of the Gemara. Rimigash said, we will not allow a marriage to the third man and will stop it by all means possible. And no mention of the fact that after they're married, we're not going to separate them. So Rambam's Chidush. And that Chidush, which he puts into his book of Code of Laws, the Mishneh Torah, is amplified in his Tshuvah, which is a frontal attack on the whole concept of Katlanit. Now, this represents the victory of rationalism, which is how we think of the Rambam. So this is an aspect of him as a Meshiv. Not only does he say that the social consequences of the Katlanit are bad, but rationally speaking, we should not be going along this path. And as we'll see, as I said next week, there are bits in the Gemara that were conditioned by irrational ideas. And today, he's talking in the 12th century, we should ignore them. And we do. There are many things in the Gemara that we do ignore, okay? We're not going to treat our diseases in the same way that the Talmud says, okay? Now, Avraham Chaim Freiman, who wrote the notes on the Blau edition of the Rambam's Tuvot, saw the Rimi Gash's Tuvah, and he says, you know, I have a problem with it. I don't know. The Rambam is giving us a different version of the Rimi Gash. Did the Rimi Gash really say that we disregard the Isur and we tell the, because he seems to be saying that the Rimigash and the Rif would go along with Andalus. Now, I've no doubt that when the Rambam reports what happened in Andalus, it's true. But when he says, and the Rif and the Rimigash support this, is that true? Again, it could be that in practice they did. And this is the difference between the Posek and the Meshiv. But it still seems a little bit OTT over the top that both the Rif and the Rimigash write very strong prohibitions on marrying the third wife, and yet the Rambam says that they were happy to go with this legal fiction, this harama. I've no way of finding out what happened because the Rambam died in 1205, and it's a little past his time for me to ask him.
Seance.
Thank
But
you.
interesting to know if the Rimigash was also sometime revolutionary in his psakim or not.
Exactly. So do we have all of the literary oeuvre of the Rimigash? I don't know. Freiman says perhaps this wasn't a tshuva of the Rimigash. Perhaps the Rimigash tshuva has been lost, and his real opinion. I mean, it would make sense because the Rambam drew his rational inspiration from his family, his father, Dayan Maimon, and the Rimigash. So this is Andalusia, okay, which
Isn't it a question of the Chatchila? They were saying what you should or shouldn't do, but b'diavad they allowed it.
But the be'evet means ve'im nisat.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, okay, that is possible. But surely you have already realized there's a big difference between what the Rambam wrote in his code, which will be faithfully copied by Rabbi Yosef Karo, and what he writes in his tshuva. What you get from the code is, yes, mustn't do it, and lechatchila, no Rav should organize a chuppah with a katlanit. However, b'diavad, once it's done, it's not the sort of thing that we will make a couple divorce each other over, okay? But it's not the right thing to do. Yet, when you read the tshuva, it seems that the right thing to do would actually have been to abolish the din of the katlanit entirely, okay? That's the feeling I got. But because we can't, then we say, okay, you know what? We, the Rabbanim, will tell you, the young couple or the older couple, go ahead, get married, find witnesses, do the ring thing, and then come to us, and you know what? We're going to do the whole thing for you. We'll write your ketubah, we'll have a sheva brachot, we'll put up the chuppah, everything is fine and hunky-dory. Okay? And that's the difference between a psak and a meishiv. Now, very quickly, because we are running out of time as always, you can peruse these tshuvot over your cocoa tonight, okay? The Rashba, who is very opposed to philosophy, whose tshuva we're going to read, he is very insistent. Now, the Rashba, of course, is a generation later, okay? 1235 to 1310. He was known as El Rab de España. He was 40 years. He was the chief rabbi of Barcelona. He was the Rav of the main synagogue, which was a huge shul, okay? Barcelona, Catalonia was an amazing center. It was Yerushalayim Asher Bisfarad, all right? And of course, if you go there today, you're hard-pressed to find a single vestige of anything Jewish. But it was a huge and flourishing center, huge. He was a rabbi, and he was regarded as the chief authority of Spanish Jewry, okay? And opposed study of philosophy and science, except for the few. And he says that I don't understand the Rambam at all. Sheila hodieni datcha b'isha katlanit. Ki yesh mi shematir ota heter gamur lekatchila. Who is that? The Rambam, who says, if I had my brothers in the first instance, I'd have no problem in marrying the katlanit to any man of her choice. And of course, he chooses her. Tshuva. I have no idea. What is the basis for this permission? Sharei machloket hishnoya ben Rebbe v'Rashbag. Kinetanya beperek haba yivimto niset larishon, etc. The Rav Savar betrays Zimne, etc., etc. Okay? V'dan ani et amatik tzat lizkut. Now, here we have another phenomenon of rabbinic interchanges. If you have somebody as great as the Rambam, you can't really dismiss him just like that. Okay? It's like when Rabbi Feinstein, Paskins Halacha, when more Haredi rabbis want to argue with him, they don't say he's talking rubbish. They say, okay, he might have thought this, that, and the other. So I have to tread carefully. Kishema, and here Dvora, we get to your point, okay? How did they die? Shema lo met harishon hasheni al
Mitato.
That's the Rambam's very generous approach to the Katlanitis, because the husbands didn't die in their beds of a disease. One fell off a bridge, okay, the Sydney Harbour Bridge, when he was trying to cross it. Or Shema Tava Umet, or he drowned, okay? וזה מחלוקת בגמרא, כי יש מי שאומר בגמרא, טעמא דקטלנית כי המקור גורם, ופסק כמותו. So, because if you say that it is the makor, then if the death was not caused by a disease that is somehow related to the sexual act, then you could say, we'll let the woman be married to a third man, even though two have died. But I don't say that this is correct. I'm just giving you possible explanation for the Rambam. Any death is enough to make a woman a katlanit, because this is her astrological damnation. Okay, she's going to kill her husbands. Now he does in fact go on to say that the reason is that she's destined to be poor. Husbands have to die because in those days you only became a rich woman if your husband was a wealthy man. And because she's destined to be poor, her husbands have to be knocked off one by one, okay? So because we say it's mazal, and the Rashba was against philosophy and science, and their role in halacha, as we'll see, was a backlash to the rationalism represented by Maimonides, he says that we are not going to be mekel at all, okay? And the Nimuke Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Ben Chaviva, also a Spaniard from Seville, says that in Nisuin, okay, it's an Isur. Lo shavkinan le, da Isurahu, vichal shofech dam ha'adam. It's committing suicide, okay? V'hayu meladin oto bevedin. And here, it does say, against the Rambam, that we put the guy into cherem, Ad sheyigaresh, until he divorces her. V'chen ra'inu Rabbeinu she'asa maaseh. Who is Rabbeinu? Rabbeinu is the Ritva. Rav Yosef ibn Chaviv was a Talmud of the Ritva, who was a Talmud of the Rashba. So we have the Maimonidean approach in favor of basically ignoring Kaplanit. Then we have a later, possibly Kabbalistic influenced approach, because the Rashba was a Talmud of the Ramban. The Ramban brought the Zohar to the attention of the Jewish communities in Europe in his Perush on the Torah. And the Zohar actually, well, the Zohar is, of course, as always, a little off the wall. But it says that you shouldn't even marry a widow, because the spirit of the first husband is there inside her. And the Zohar describes this in physical terms. The husband's spirit is very feisty, and it dwells in her womb. And when another man tries to penetrate, the spirit of the first husband fights him. And if the spirit of the first husband is stronger than the spirit of the second husband, he's going to kill the second guy. So Zohar Sefer Hasidim, which is also a mystical work, says the same thing, that you will be required, 11, you will be required to explain to God when you go to heaven why you did this terrible thing. because it's like, it's suicide, okay? The Shulchan Aruch, Even Haezer, Paskins Isha, Shenis'et o nitarsa lishnei anashim. This is the psak. If you're a rabbi, you open the Shulchan Aruch. Correct? Is that correct? Exactly. You open up the Shulchan Aruch, and what you read, Isha shenis'et o nitarsa lishnei anashim. Umetu, lo tinasei lishlishi. Don't marry the third man. Shekvar huchzaka liot anashia metim. Husbands are going to die. V'im niset lo tetzeh, because the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, always cites the Rambam.
I wonder how long people lived at that time, because now, people are very active in their 80s, and my mother's buried a few men, but the thing is they were in their 70s and 80s. So I don't think that a person should be a katlanit if the person dies in their 70s or 80s.
Yeah, well, that's why we'd say im niset lo tetzeh, okay? But shall we say we're talking about younger people when it's a real issue? The next bit is about the later Ashkenazi approach, which is much more liberal. I'm going to put that against the Black Death. Now, when did the Black Death cut down the population of Europe? Okay. The Black Death is, of course, in the 14th century. Joe, is that you? Okay, I'm trying to say something. The Black Death, 14th century, Ashkenaz, Europe, kills a third of the population, okay? And now we're short of people. So against that background, we can understand the Trumat Hadeshen, or Rav Israeline, okay? From the late 14th century until the middle of the 15th century. The Black Death was 1348 to 1349. Israeline was 14th, late 14th and early 15th, and Rabbi Yaakov Weil, the Maharyu, okay, 1385 to 1455, and then we have the Noda, the Uda, who's the 18th century. So I think we are out of time. So I'm going to leave these until next week, and then we will start, hopefully, on the Rambam's famous letter on astrology, which is again a tshuva, but a longer tshuva written to an entire community, the community of Marseille or Montpellier, we're not sure which one, dealing with astrology in general. But what I wanted to do in terms of the Rambam was to show you how the Rambam's tshuva on the Katanit is quite a remarkable one. If you think about the way in which a posek would normally go to treat the Gemara and the Rishonim, he's done something entirely different, okay? He's really reduced the whole concept of the Katanit to something that's not substantial at all. And he's also created what may be a reality in Andalusia, or it may be how the Rambam would have wanted it, because what he did in Egypt was exactly that, okay? Clearly, rabbis in Egypt, as we know, were a little surprised by the Rambam. If you were to encounter the Rambam as a fellow rabbi, you might also be somewhat taken aback, okay? And then, of course, you'd have to deal with his tongue lashing, which is something else. But in any case, Rambam, this tshuva, I think, is remarkable because it brings to the forefront one of the other features of Maimonidean Judaism, namely the quest for rationality, even in the face of halakha psuka. And we're going to see that, okay? Now, just as in the case of the Shmad, the Rambam is very gentle in his Mishneh Torah, his code of law, when he indicates that there may be instances in which you can, if it's a shmad light, you can in fact say a shahada and still be a good Jew. So here, when he cites the Katanit in Hilchot Isurei Biyah, he has to. It's a part of the Gemara, and he's codifying the law. He puts in that if they marry, we do not make them separate. But what he says in the Tshuva is much more than that. So I leave you with that as the shiur. Any questions or comments?
I wanted to ask if we can generalize this tshuva, because in Niseit Lotetze, I don't know, but I think we find it 10 times in Rambam. Can we, in each case, apply this reasoning?
No, we can't. We have to look at the context. Some cases of Niset Lo Tetzeh is what I said to Dvorah a little earlier. Kiddushin are tofsin, but the marriage is asur, Jean. Okay, there are cases. The Kohen and the Grusha, it's a similar case. Okay, Kiddushin tofsin, but it is asur. So sometimes Niset Lo Tetzeh has a technical halakhic reason, but here, as we see from the Rambam himself, Niset Lo Tetzeh is in fact an expression of his rationality, that Niset Lo Tetzeh, because you could have got married in the first case without any problem at all. Okay? And therefore, this whole picture, this whole scenario of what happened in Andalus, which the Rambam reintroduced in Egypt when he became the supreme halachic authority. Okay? Now, clearly, we look at the Rashba, we look at the Rosh, and even the Rif and the Rimigash. Do we have all of their original writings? I don't know. It's very suggestive, because they don't seem to be saying what the Rambam says they did. So I leave you with that puzzle. We'll do a little more on this next week, wrap all this up with Inodah Biudah, who is very similar to the Rambam, as we'll see, 18th century, 1703 to 1793, Rabbi Yechezkel Landau of Prague. Again, he finds a way of resolving the philosophical rational approach with conventional halakha. How he does it next week, same time, same channel. This is it. Good evening, everybody. Laila Tov, Besorot Tovot, and all the very best. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.